Okay, so the first slide there. Can we do better in New Zealand? So I've been working in the field of youth addiction for about the last 10 years, and there's been steady development over that time, but I'd have to say pretty hodgepodge and patchy services around New Zealand. There's not much in the way of consistency across the sector. What tends to happen is that local interests and regional priorities and variable decision making have meant that we have a treatment landscape in this area which is most notable for its ad hoc nature. So what I want to do today is outline the current evidence for effective youth alcohol and other drug treatment and discuss how we might incorporate this into a wider youth alcohol and drug service framework for New Zealand, both in urban and rural settings. But first I'm going to set the scene by telling you a story about a young woman, Sam, who has been involved with services in Auckland. Sam doesn't know her father, and there's a protection order out against her mum, as unfortunately over the years Sam's been witnessed and been a victim of violence from her mum, who has a methamphetamine problem, and she has various gang-affiliated partners over the years. Despite this considerable adversity, Sam seemed to get through her childhood okay, and she was a pretty good kid at primary school. However, as often happens, Sam became a teenager, entered secondary school, and she gained increasing insight into the sort of rubbish hand that life had dealt her, and became increasingly despondent and angry. About this time she met some new friends, and they were older than her, they were fun to be around, and she discovered that drinking alcohol and smoking cannabis with them gave her some respite from the general misery that accompanied her in school and at home. Grandma began asking questions of her and did her best to put boundaries around Sam's time out of the house, but Grandma had a lot on her plate as well, and it was a struggle to rein in Sam, who was getting increasingly angry and impatient at home. Last year, Sam was sexually assaulted at a party. She didn't tell anyone about this because it was embarrassing and she felt in some way responsible. She tried to forget what had happened, but it seemed that the more she tried to block out the memories, the more they would haunt her in nightmares and daydreams. Her sleep deteriorated, her mood got worse, and she started buying cannabis regularly and smoking it at home late at night, as it was the only thing that helped her sleep. She became increasingly angry with everything and started lashing out at her half-brothers, at times hating them so much that she had occasionally had thoughts of wanting to kill them. And this began to worry her too. And about this time she began to recognise she was on track to turning out like her mum, something that from an early age she had vowed she'd never wanted to happen. So at this point, many things could have happened to Sam. She could have dropped out of school and hung out with her substance-abusing friends full-time. She could have run away from home, gone to live with her mother and the mongrel mob boyfriend. She might have severely assaulted her brothers and ended up in the youth justice system. In Sam's case, what actually happened was that she came into contact with youth and alcohol and drug services, and things gradually changed for her. At this point, I just want to stop talking about Sam and answer the question, is alcohol and drug treatment effective in young people? And the answer to that is yes. Longer term studies haven't been done, but in the short and medium term, it reduces substance misuse, and it also AOD treatment also does these things: reduce problem behaviour, increase self-esteem, improve academic attainment, reduce criminal activity, etc. And it's been shown in a variety of settings, from residential to outpatient to schools. So if AOD treatment in young people is a worthwhile activity, how should we best provide it? Well, I'm a realist and a pragmatist, and I accept that youth alcohol and drug services in the grand scheme of things are just a tiny proportion of the overall health budget. It's understandable that they don't command the attention of service planners in the same way that larger services might. That said, they're an important area, and we can organise an effective and coherent response. My argument is that because it's a small and specialised area, planning needs to be done nationally rather than being left to funders and planners and individual DHBs who may, but may not have the expertise in what is a pretty specialised area. I'm aware that health services continue to tighten their belts, and there's a risk that In this environment, poorly staffed or ineffective or small services will be cut. And this description does unfortunately apply to a lot of youth AOD services at the moment. To lose that little funding that we have that's earmarked for youth AOD treatment would be a shame. I would hope that if NCAT and the Ministry can create a clear youth alcohol and drug service structure and specifications, DHBs could aim to, over time, realign their services along the lines of a nationally agreed framework. And gradually, funding for the treatment that currently exists but tends to be scattered across a wide and disparate array of services could be directed in a more consistent way so that it doesn't matter whether a young person lives in Opotiki or Otara or Omaramara or Owaka, they will still get access to effective and quality AOD care. So what would this framework look like? Well, this is kind of a schematic, and I'll talk about it briefly, but before we do that, I'll just return to Sam's story again for a bit. So, after a series of misdemeanours, Sam was on the verge of being suspended from her school. But the Dean put her on a management plan and asked her to see the school guidance counsellor. And the guidance counsellor enrolled her on a skills course run by an NGO service that provided school-based programs for at-risk youth. The program had as its focus building on strengths, developing coping skills for young people using a CBT framework, and incorporated into this program were modules on mental health and AOD problems. Sam didn't really engage with this program, and she didn't like the other kids in it. But she did like the youth worker who ran it, and she learned a few things that helped her cope better with her anger and some of the minor bullying that she'd always had to endure. She also realised that feeling sad and angry all the time might not simply be because of her miserable situation, and that there might be other things other than smoking and drinking that she could do to help her feel better. There's a few components. I'm not going to be able to talk about all of them, but I'll just talk briefly about group CBT programs. These can be provided in schools, mainstream and alt-eds, primary care and in youth health services, including cultural services, and they should be targeted at identified at-risk young people and not part of a curriculum for all students. They need to involve skills training, and they need to integrate health, mental health and AOD issues together. They need to adhere to group CBT strategies, as these have been shown to be effective, whereas other approaches such as drug education groups are not well supported by the evidence. Group CBT programs need to be able to refer to more specialist services and get consult and liaison from them. And outpatient services, which I'll talk about later, and residential services can incorporate these kind of group programs into their services. Okay, so we'll return back to Sam. So the youth worker running the skills program offered to refer Sam to an outpatient AOD service, the one that I work for in Auckland. Sam wasn't too keen on this, but the youth worker went along with Sam to the first appointment and met the counsellor, who was from my service, and we'll call her Rose, at lunchtime in her school. Sam thought the counsellor seemed nice, and they began to work together, focusing on a few key issues. These included gradually reducing her substance use, helping her with her disrupted sleep, which was one of the main reasons she smoked the cannabis, and managing her anger, which was on the verge of getting out of control at home. After a couple of sessions, Sam began to open up about what was happening at home, and Rose became more concerned. She asked to talk to Grandma, but Sam was initially against this, fearing that she would get in trouble with her grandmother for being a drug addict. Rose took time to discuss with Sam what would actually happen if they did meet, stressing that the focus would be on making things better at home, and rather than telling Grandma everything that Sam had been doing. Contact was made with her, and she was made with her grandmother, and she was made of the potential risk and coached around ways to minimise this. It was clear from this that Grandma was completely overwhelmed at home, managing the younger half-siblings who had behavioural problems of their own, and she was given information about accessing parent training programs in the area. Rose, the counsellor, was also concerned about Sam's mood, and so once Sam was well engaged, she asked me to see her. And I visited her at school, and it was clear that she had PTSD symptoms, long-standing depression, in addition to her cannabis dependence. And so I provided recommendations to her grandma, and her GP with regard to potential treatment, and supported Rose around her ongoing management. So the next bit I'm just going to talk about is outpatient youth AOD services, similar to the one that I work at in Auckland CAD's youth service, Altatai. I think the main centres and some sort of outpatient AOD service should be the mainstay of a region's treatment service. They need to be able to offer a variety of modalities of treatment, and they need to be mobile and flexible. They need to offer individual interventions, family interventions, group interventions, detoxification expertise via an alcohol and other drug nurse, and management of mild to moderate coexisting mental health disorder and risk. They need to be able to. They need to have close liaison with CAMS for those young people with more severe mental health and risk issues, and they need to be able to help child and adolescent mental health services with their young people who have coexisting AOD disorder. But the key thing is that they need to be there as to provide consult and liaison to the other services who might be providing alcohol and other drug for the treatment for the region too. Okay, so we'll go back to Sam. So things carried on, and Grandma felt more supported in her parenting course, and she got better control of things at home, taking the load off Sam somewhat. Sam reduced her cannabis use, her mood improved, and there was a marked improvement in her anger and irritability. She began participating more at school, especially in her art class, something that she was quite good at. She made a new friend in this art class and spent more time with her rather than the older drug-using friends. After a few more sessions with Rose from our service, Sam decided that she no longer needed an alcohol and drug service, and she was discharged to the care of her school guidance counsellor. But about 9 months later, she rang again and asked to see Rose. And it transpired that 3 months ago, there'd been an incident with her mother coming around to the grandma's house and kidnapping her half-brother for a few days. And understandably, stress levels at home had risen following this terrifying thing, and everyone was feeling unsafe. Sam had relapsed into smoking cannabis, and this time there was also an uncle who was living nearby who seemed to have access to an unlimited supply of cannabis. So Sam's use had escalated to over 2 tinnies a day, and Sam felt unable to control it or stop, despite the fact that she wanted to. So Rose saw her a couple of times, and together they decided that things at home were presently too difficult and that she was unlikely to make any realistic changes whilst she was surrounded by the stress and with such a ready supply of cannabis. So Rose referred her to the residential treatment service in Auckland and Odyssey House, and accompanied her to an appointment where she was assessed for the program. The residential program liaised with her school, and after entering, Sam was able to continue with some of her NCAT credits while she was there. Rose from our service met with her a couple of times in the first few weeks she was in the residential program. However, once she was settled, she was discharged from our service. So, so residential youth AOD services, they can provide respite for young people who are in really difficult situations, detoxification for those who are dependent, as well as intensive treatment. They're expensive though, and so we need to use them efficiently. In general, access to these kind of programs would ideally be through either outpatient AOD, CAMS or forensic services, and priority given to those who haven't succeeded in outpatient treatment. If we have residential services with flexible and shorter programs that could be extended if required, this will mean that more young people will have access to them. Family involvement, evidence says that family involvement needs to be a key part of programs, and reintegration and discharge planning in terms of aftercare is also really key. So as far as I know, Sam is still in the residential service and doing really well. What I've been talking about is kind of giving you an idea of a young person's journey through treatment services in a more urban centre. But I'll just introduce you to another young person from a rural area, just because that's equally as important, and we can also have a good response in those areas. So I'll just tell you a bit about someone called Victor. I've changed the names of these young people. I met Victor when I was doing a locum in Whakatane. Victor's 14 and he lives on the road to Te Kaha, which is kind of where you get to just before you step off the edge of the East Cape. Right up there. And so I went to see him at school, but he'd been wagging, and so we ended up meeting him where he'd been playing around on the beach down on the coast. We talked to him by the car, and I remember Victor because the most startling thing about him was that he was wearing two different shoes. He had a jandal on his left foot and a red sneaker on his right, and I asked him about this, and he said he had lost his other sneaker, and since a few weeks ago, and since then he'd had to borrow his sister's jandal as he had no other shoes. He lived in a 3-bedroom house with no power and 7 siblings and his dad, and his mum had passed away 2 years previous. He had smoked cannabis since age 11, and although this wasn't a daily thing, it was pretty much part of his life. He was being seen by the Outreach Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service worker from Whakatane since the local GP had become concerned that Victor was hearing voices. And the interesting thing about the voices that Victor had started hearing was that they were loudest when Victor was not smoking cannabis. So that's how I met Victor. I won't sort of go into the details about him, but in terms of youth AOD services in smaller or rural areas, assembling and funding a critical mass of staff required to make an effective service is difficult, and because of this it makes sense for youth alcohol and drug treatment to be delivered in close association with local CAM services. However, simply asking child and adolescent mental health services to do AOD work is not the answer, and it won't lead to better treatment. I advocate the establishment of small AOD teams which can sit within or alongside CAM services in the regions. That way the alcohol and drug workers can access all the support and expertise from the CAM service while retaining their own identity as a distinct service. And I think this is important because often young people with addiction problems or don't see themselves as needing mental health support even though they do. So a rural AOD team might comprise 2 or 3 alcohol and drug clinicians. For example, a dual diagnosis clinician and 2 alcohol and drugs, and maybe there'd be access to a nurse who would have detoxification expertise or training in this. There'd be supervision and active involvement from senior CAMS team members and good links with them, especially early psychosis teams, family therapists and psychiatry or psychologists. And together this core AOD staff should be able to provide a range of outpatient therapies required for most alcohol and drug difficulties. So to recap, this slide here demonstrates the challenge that we have in the field. Young people want to have fun. They want to be doing things like this. They're not interested in this. But that's kind of what we have to offer with alcohol and drug services, to some extent. And I think it's more of a challenge in the addiction field than in the mental health field because in most cases, young people with mental health difficulties, be it depression, anxiety, they have symptoms which are in and of themselves distressing, and so they're more active in their help seeking. I feel terrible, I want some help for this. Whereas things have to get really bad before young people with substance use problems see themselves as needing treatment. And unfortunately, when they're that bad, that treatment is much less effective than if we can get them early. So because of that, we need an alcohol and drug service system that's maximally flexible and easily accessible. Services need to be able to respond immediately and opportunistically and to be engagement focused primarily. To operate in this way, services need to have well-trained and competent and professional staff, and achieving this needs a long-term view. At the service I work in, we now have 18 very competent AOD workers, and they manage a range of comorbidity in their clients. And I feel as confident working with those AOD workers as I do working with child and adolescent mental health workers and good CAMS teams. But this did not suddenly happen. Rather, our service has developed over the last 10 years from a core of about 5 staff initially. And most of the development has come from good internal supervision, on-the-job training and education within the service. And this has been achieved, so essentially a service like ours has been achieved via consolidation and consistency. So we need change, but I think the change that we need to see in the area is a change that's geared towards creating a culture of gradual development and consolidation of what we have. So yeah.